Dr. Daniel Cross Turner, and I'm Head of Programming and Outreach for the Georgetown County Library System. And welcome today to the library's series of online programming that's celebrating our state's deep and diverse food traditions. It's called From Blue Hills to Green Sea, representing South Carolina Foodways. Our programs are generously sponsored by South Carolina Humanities, as well as the Friends of the Waccamaw Library and the Friends of the Georgetown Library. So we're grateful to those organizations for making this series possible. All right. And we go from the upstate, the Blue Hills, the upcountry of South Carolina, that corner in the northwest, all the way down to the Green Sea, with a bunch of experts in foodways telling us what's important about the history behind the food that we consume in this state. So we have a great slate of presenters, and I hope you'll enjoy all of the presentations in this series, all 9 of them. Today we have one of the brightest young scholars of the New Southern Studies, Dr. Zackary Vernon, and he is Associate Professor of English at Appalachian State University, across the state line into the mountains of North Carolina there. Dr. Vernon's presentation entwines Blue Hills and Green Sea, weaving together Appalachian foodways with our low country traditions. His title is Contested Cuisines, Examining Controversies in Southern Foodways. Focusing on Chef Shaun Brock's Charleston-based restaurants, Dr. Vernon explores controversies over the potential appropriation of African-American culinary traditions. While many critiques against white male chefs like Brock are valid, one aspect that has not been discussed is the fact that Brock, a Virginia native, draws much of his culinary inspiration from his native Appalachia. Dr. Vernon argues that Appalachia needs to be a part of this important conversation because even for coastal restaurants, the roots of the new Southern cuisine often stretch back to the mountains. A prolific scholar and creative writer, Dr. Vernon is editor of the essay collection Eco-Criticism and the Future of Southern Studies from 2019, and has published eco-critical accounts of eating and drinking cultures. Zach is a native of Georgetown County. He is also Dr. Jessica Martell's equal half and fellow life traveler, and Dr. Martell is giving a presentation in the series on South Carolina moonshine up in the dark corner of the state, in the upstate. Right, so enjoy Dr. Zackary Vernon and his exploration of some of the contested cuisines across South Carolina, from Blue Hills to Green Sea.
All right, well, hello to everyone out there. I'm very excited to give this talk today on contested cuisines in the South. But first, I'd like to thank Daniel Cross Turner for putting together this wonderful symposium. I'd also like to thank everyone who is taking part in and watching the event. Of course, I wish that we could be together in person, but hopefully these sorts of events will be able to be in person again in the not too distant future. So my name is Zackary Vernon. I'm a professor at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. And as you'll see today, my research focuses primarily on Southern and Appalachian cultures. One of the most intense controversies in recent years surrounding American foodways resulted from an article by Hilary Dixler Canavan, published in March of 2016 on the food-centric website eater.com. Canavan's article, entitled How Gullah Cuisine Has Transformed Charleston Dining, Exploring the Line Between Shared History and Appropriation, examines how and why Charleston, South Carolina has become one of the best culinary destinations in the United States, with its restaurants and restaurateurs winning an array of prestigious awards, as well as being featured in many TV shows, including Anthony Bourdain's 2 shows, No Reservations and Parts Unknown, as well as The Mind of a Chef, Top Chef, Chef's Table, and Padma Lakshmi's Taste the Nation. In the Eater.com article, Canavan takes Charleston's food scene to task because of its lack of diversity. The city's culinary accolades, for example, are rarely, if ever, given to people of color. This becomes particularly alarming when one realizes how many of Charleston's culinary traditions are derived from African American, and more specifically Gullah Geechee foodways. According to Canavan, these culinary traditions were brought with enslaved individuals from West Africa to South Carolina and have been maintained amongst the Gullah Geechee people who are direct descendants of those enslaved individuals. Canavan suggests that the Charleston food scene is part of the latest culinary craze to locate authentic cuisines. And she argues that this has inspired white male chefs to serve up purportedly traditional foods. This, in and of itself, can be annoying. Charging exorbitant prices for faux folksy food on cutesy vintage plates. However, this becomes especially problematic if that same food was actually invented and prepared first by enslaved individuals and then domestic workers and finally by economically disadvantaged cooks, almost all of whom were and are African American. So chefs, usually white and male in fancy downtown restaurants in Charleston and across the South, are often portraying historically Black, are often preparing historically Black food and then profiting from that food, which is understood by diners to be an authentic representation of the region. Such dishes include, according to Canavan, crab rice, conch stew, okra soup, head-on fried whiting, and purlieu. Canavan asserts, quote, conversations about the subject often focus on the idea of cooking with local historically accurate ingredients, as opposed to the fact that slavery was the genesis for said ingredients arriving and thriving in the South. That white people appropriate Black culture and cash in on it without giving credit where credit is due comes as no surprise to me. Such insidious forms of appropriation have long existed in the South, with everything from music to fashion to food. But Canavan's claims did surprise and enrage some. Immediately following the publication of her article, various social media platforms exploded with vitriolic commentary, and people, usually white people, tried to discredit Canavan and her argument. African-American food historian Michael Twitty says, quote, I've noticed that only certain people get pissed off over this appropriation conversation, and it's usually the people who make money off the transaction of selling the culture. I would expand Twitty's account of the situation slightly. I think white people, regardless of whether they benefit directly from white chefs hawking of Black food, are frustrated by this controversy because it problematizes what they are so desperate to believe marks a return to cultural authenticity in a postmodern world seemingly plagued by inauthentic, homogenized, globalized culture. But regardless of motivation, we can say with certainty that white people are upset because their supposed cultural saviors are actually resurrecting a culture not their own and selling it without acknowledging or paying the originators of that culture, namely African Americans. The chef most routinely called out for the appropriation and commodification of African American culinary traditions is Shaun Brock, the James Beard Award-winning chef and owner of Charleston's much celebrated restaurants, Husk and McCrady's. Husk is now also expanded to locations in Savannah, Greenville, and Nashville, and Brock is also opening 2 new restaurants in Nashville. In the wake of the Eater.com article, Michael Twitty wrote an open letter to Brock stating, quote, "I insist on my right of return as the descendant of Charleston's enslaved and of the rice growers that gave the Low Country a story to sell. The South shall rise again, but will African Americans? We need economic development, food justice, and most of all, we refuse to be put at the periphery of our narrative when we should remain at its center. This isn't technically your responsibility, Shaun Brock, but if part of our story is in your hands, so too must be part of a solution." Food writer John T. Edge also responded to Canavan's article in a piece in the Oxford American that he co-authored with Nigerian-born chef Tunde Way. This article, like Canavan's, seeks to analyze white male power and privilege in the restaurant industry. Edge writes, "At a moment when conversations about food have become central to the American dialogue about identity, the issues Dixler and Twitty raised about authenticity and ownership and appropriation will fester if they're not further explored." Edge goes on in the article to say, quote, "Inquiries about power were primary. If I bought the argument embedded in the Eater article, if I acknowledged the inequities and subjugations on which much of Southern cuisine was built," Tunde asked, "was I willing to cede what whites had gained at the expense of blacks? Am I willing now to cede what I have gained?" I agree with Edge on the point that it is important to examine race and racism when exploring Southern foodways, so as not to allow these difficult issues to fester more than they already have. However, as you'll see, I don't believe Edge does an adequate job examining these issues or his own position within them. Tunde Way, in his portion of the essay, provides incisive commentary on the political nature of food and the way in which food-based identity is fraught if a dominant group appropriates the culture of a marginalized one. Way calls out Shaun Brock as one of the most egregious cases of a white chef who, he says, unabashedly cooks Black food. Furthermore, Way asserts that it is white privilege that would lead Brock to quarrel with an authority like Michael Twitty on the question of his appropriation of African American cuisine. Discussing the fact that Brock may be an appropriator and commodifier of African American food is not the only purpose of Edge and Way's article. Way also calls out Edge, saying, quote, "White privilege permits a humble, folksy, and honest white boy, i.e. John T. Edge, to diligently study the canon of appropriated Black food, then receive extensive celebration in magazines, newspapers, and television programming for reviving the fortunes of Southern cuisine." More pointedly, Way asks, "You're a graceful man, John T., so what will you willingly give up to ensure the Southern food narrative services properly and fully the contributions of Black Southerners?" At first glance, this exchange seems open and genuine and perhaps even meaningful. Edge does acknowledge that, quote, "For much of our region's history, Blacks and women did much of the conceptual and physical labor in the region's kitchens, but received niggling credit." However, Edge does not ever satisfactorily answer his own questions or those of Way. In the conclusion of the article, he simply states, "Still, I know this about myself. I'm not willing to step away. I'm not able. What I can offer rings meager even to me. I aim to listen more and speak less. I pledge to cede what is not mine and try to understand the difference." This non-response response becomes additionally vexing when considered in light of a more recent controversy. Last year, several women and people of color asked Edge to step down as director of the Southern Foodways Alliance at the University of Mississippi. Tunde Way was among those who called for Edge to cede his position. The writer Nicole Taylor is quoted in a New York Times article about the controversy, saying, "When you look at the history of the Southern Foodways Alliance, it's built on Black stories, and there is not one Black person in a position of power. As we saw before from Edge, he offered an unsatisfying response when asked by the New York Times about his possible resignation, saying, quote, 'I want to embrace the critique. I intend to listen, and I don't listen well enough, and I'm still at it, and I appreciate it.' According to the New York Times, plans to elevate the roles of two of its longstanding staff members, Melissa Booth Hall and Mary Beth Lassiter, to positions of co-director on par with Edge are in development. However, based on the current website for the Southern Foodways Alliance, Melissa Booth Hall is listed as managing director and Mary Beth Lassiter as associate director, while Edge is listed as founding director. So, as of yet, little power, it seems, has been ceded. So, what can we take away from these controversies? First, we must consider who is in positions of power, from executive chefs to center directors to magazine writers, and how they were able to obtain those positions. It is not merely talent, but rather privilege based on class, gender, and most importantly, race that enables people to climb the ladder. Another takeaway from this controversy is historical accuracy and honesty. White male chefs in particular need to acknowledge the fact that most of the South's ingredients and culinary traditions derive from Black chefs and often Black women. A final takeaway is economic. Historical accuracy must be coupled with opportunities for contemporary African-American culinarians to become executive chefs and restaurant owners. Part of this has to do with the recent so-called professionalization of restaurant kitchens, wherein degrees from top culinary programs have become the norm to enable chefs to land high-profile restaurant jobs or to start their own kitchens. Access to this kind of education requires tremendous privilege in terms of time and money. In addition, economic barriers to starting restaurants reflect economic disparities more broadly that have historical links to slavery and subsequent racist lending practices and real estate owning patterns that perpetuate white wealth and prevent people of marginalized groups from entering the restaurant industry, except at the lowest levels. These takeaways leave us with difficult but necessary questions. The solutions will not come easily, given that these issues are based on large, long-standing structural inequalities. The good news is that these controversies demonstrate that we're now at least having the conversation. And having the conversation is the first step to righting these historical wrongs. For the remainder of my time today, I'd like to turn to another facet of this controversy, and one that is not discussed as often. This will bring us to what is now my home region. While originally from Pawleys Island, I now live in Boone, North Carolina, which is in southern Appalachia. This region has become both a personal and professional interest of mine over the last few years. And this turn, for good or ill, brings us back to Shaun Brock. While many of the critiques against white male chefs like Brock are valid, as I have noted, one aspect of this issue that has not been discussed as much is the fact that Brock, a native of Wise County, Virginia, draws much of his culinary inspiration from Appalachia. Brock's personal and familial history is decidedly Appalachian, not Low Country, despite his close association with Charleston. Brock grew up in the coal fields of Southwest Virginia, and all the men in his immediate family worked in the coal industry. After his father's death, when he was a child, Brock lived on his grandmother's farm, where he developed his interest in cooking and his investment in ingredients provenance. Because they were living in what today we would call a food desert, Brock's family tended to grow most of what they ate. Brock honed his skills as a chef, first in his grandmother's kitchen, before later working in several restaurants and going to culinary school at Johnson & Wales in Charleston. To be clear, I am not seeking to exonerate Brock of the critiques leveled against him. Rather, I want to argue that Appalachia needs to be a part of this important conversation, because even for coastal restaurants like Husk, the roots of the so-called new Southern cuisine often stretch back to the mountains. And yet, Appalachia remains almost wholly excluded from the conversation. What I want to argue is that low country food is not Brock's only culinary inspiration, and it may not even be his primary one. Brock takes seriously his Appalachian heritage and gives it a lot of credit for his culinary viewpoint. This is clear in an episode entitled Roots of the show The Mind of a Chef, which follows him for 8 episodes of its second season. This episode, the only one of its kind in the series, shows Brock preparing what he calls good old-fashioned hillbilly food with his mother. Throughout the episode, Brock, his mother, and all the other chefs he meets obsessively trumpet the cucina povera, or poor cooking, of Appalachia. But I'm left wondering, why does Brock relegate his Appalachian identity to a single episode of The Mind of a Chef? Why might he be reluctant to mention this heritage in other episodes of this or in other media outlets, such as Anthony Bourdain's episode of Parts Unknown devoted to Charleston, or the long profile article on Brock published in The New Yorker? Additionally, why is Brock so eager to promote himself and his restaurants as Southern more often than Appalachian? What is it about the South that sells? And what is it about Appalachia that perhaps makes restaurateurs reticent to accept or highlight that mantle? One possible answer would simply be that Brock's flagship restaurants began in Charleston and not Appalachia. This, though, seems too easy, because the menus of Brock's restaurants often feature a range of specifically Appalachian ingredients and dishes. For example, Brock is known for greasy beans, leather breeches, cathead biscuits, corn pone, hoe cakes, pickles, preserves, sorghum, poke salad, and soured corn, as much as he is for ingredients and dishes of African and African-American origin, such as red cowpeas, okra, collards, hoppin' john, and goat stew. And yet, Appalachia has remained largely absent from the conversation until fairly recently. Are Appalachia's culinary attributes overlooked because the region remains, as Roger Cunningham has argued, a blank space between North and South, a vast perceived nothingness often disregarded by American popular culture? Does Appalachia remain the South's other, the other's other? And does this sense of double alterity change the way Appalachian cuisine is perceived even within the Southeast? In practical terms, does a chef like Brock, along with his agents, publicists, and producers, shy away from the label Appalachian because nationally and globally, it still carries a certain taint? In other words, Southern food may generally be regarded as hip, while Appalachian food is either unknown and thus forgotten, or is reviled due to lingering stereotypes of the region as being poor, backward, and unsophisticated. Even a recent Washington Post article hailing Appalachian food as the next big thing suggests that it is only the humble iteration of the region that could be a hot new trend. When lauded, Appalachian food is described using condescending rhetoric. Simple, homegrown, honest, traditional, humble food, as opposed to the sophisticated, cutting edge, innovative, cerebral, artistic, risky, revolutionary, molecular gastronomic haute cuisine associated typically with white food in top restaurants. Why does Appalachian food, supposedly the next big thing, have to be humble? Why can't sophisticated Appalachia be the next big thing? In an interview for Garden and Gun in September of 2019, Brock proclaimed that his focus is now on Appalachia for his 2 new restaurants in Nashville. He states, quote, "One of the reasons I'm focusing on Appalachia is that's what's in my DNA. But my goal is to do for Appalachia what I tried to do with the Low Country, immerse myself into researching and working on an obsessive level to help bring back a lot of these Appalachian varietals of animals and plants and traditions that are at risk of disappearing." The reasons for this could be purely personal, a matter of DNA, as he says. It could, however, be the result of his immense success. Brock is now free to pursue interests, such as Appalachian cuisine, that are less appealing to a broad audience. His motivation could also be to move away from the controversies that have surrounded him in the South Carolina Low Country. The obsessive research that Brock plans to do in Appalachia will be less likely to be perceived as cultural appropriation, especially when he can fall back on his claims to an insider authenticity in Appalachia. Plus, in the American imagination, Appalachia is perceived to be largely white. So Brock may hope that race will not enter the conversation about revitalizing heritage in the way that it inevitably did in the Low Country. Going forward, I would like to explore the idea that there are many wellsprings of regional food. While I'm attendant to the fact that the African American South is one wellspring, and undoubtedly the deepest, Southern Appalachia is another, with a myriad of influences, which also include African American cuisine, as well as Native American, Scotch-Irish, English, German, Hungarian, and Italian. In conclusion, I'd like to consider whether Shaun Brock's restaurants, whether we love them or hate them, can provide an opportunity to open up more dialogue between the coastal South and the mountain South.